This time we are going to create our design system, or better said, we are going to focus on the colors and typography this time. Of course, there are many plugins to make maybe this process much easier, but since you're trying to make it first time, it's much better to start working manually and not letting other plugins or applications work instead of you, because you need to understand the principles first, and then later it's much easier just to include some plugins for the color designs or color systems to maybe create your grayscales or maybe to create your typographies first. So yeah, let's get started with the colors first. That's maybe the most easiest part. What we need are primary colors, probably secondary colors, but in this case maybe not. We will try to focus mostly on the primary colors and grayscale behind that. So primary colors or primary color in this case is going to be our blue with maybe a light shade and maybe some darker shades, and we are going to create maybe some gray scale colors. Okay, so how we are going to do that? We are having these images right here that we can see, and the colors that we are going to use are going to be from these screens. That's why we need the mood board to create or start the project. So I'm seeing now what blue should we use. For example, this blue is okay, but it has that purple tint or maybe pinkish tint to it, so maybe let's not go with that one. For example, this blue color is totally solid option, but for example, I don't like it when it's filled too much, and it looks like it just looks too corporate. For example, it's more of like formal. It doesn't have any pastel representation. This right here is just without any blue colors. This one is maybe too bright for my taste. It doesn't really matter. You can choose maybe something that you like. Maybe you really like this color and you're going to stick with that. But I think maybe with our case, I think this blue color is much better option. Maybe this one, for example. I'm going through these interfaces, and for example, this one is totally fine to use. Or maybe this blue color is also amazing, but what I want to do is maybe create that dark bluish interface, so probably I will go with this color, and our interface is going to be maybe similar to this one. I really like the way that they display this as a dark color above, and in this case, and the important elements to display them in the white background. So maybe we are going to take more inspirations from this kind of a design. So what we are going to do is maybe create few shades of the primary color. How we can do that is maybe just create some rectangles. We go to the rectangle and just hold the shift button and maybe create it. It doesn't really matter for the dimension because we are going to apply it into our design system. So how we are going to do that? We're going to our color, choose our color picker, and maybe choose this color. And we can see the hex code that you can maybe input. If you don't have this picture right here, you can input this 0D6FFD with 100% opacity. And we are seeing now this color right here. What we can do is maybe duplicate it with holding Alt or Option key on the keyboard. And how we are going to now change it is just maybe choose other shade. Now in this case we don't have the maybe slightly darker option or maybe slightly darker color than this one. So how we are going to do it is maybe just tone it down like this, for example. Okay, and something like that, for example. I think that's enough. And let's duplicate it one more time. As you can see, it snaps with smart snapping option. When we are moving our object, we are going to see the distance is exactly the same between our objects. That is going to be really important when we start working on our project. So yeah, let's tone it down a little bit more. For example, like this one is solid. Okay, and let's create 2 more colors, maybe to create this one. And if you hold Command or Option or Control D, it's just going to duplicate this if you're holding it or just tapping it on the keyboard, or we can undo the process. Okay, let's maybe create something a little bit more brighter than this one. Okay, maybe something like this. And let's see, maybe something like this. It doesn't really need to be exactly my hex code. I'm just providing you the example. And the way that we are going to add them to the local styles, it's just going to be really, really simple, and we can always change it. So if we now start the project and don't like it maybe, or we don't like some of the colors that we are seeing, it's really easy to just change it. So what we are having here is just a 5 shades of primary color, or 4 shades of that primary color. And now let's add our grayscale. So let's start with maybe pure black color. It's just going to be 0 across the board, and maybe duplicate it and change to something else. For example, this color looks amazing. Let's copy it up. Let's duplicate this one as well, and maybe change it to maybe something slightly more with some shade, for example. Let's move it maybe like this, because on the left side you can see it's more of like grayscale, and how we are going on the right, it's more of like color choice. So let's also duplicate it and maybe move this slightly up. Okay, let's now duplicate. Oh, let's duplicate this one and maybe choose something slightly brighter. Let's duplicate this one as well. Okay, and maybe choose something a little bit brighter. Okay, it doesn't really need to have exact amount of the shades. It's just personal preference really at the end of the day. So maybe let's stick with this really bright gray, and let's duplicate this last one to the pure white. So we need some colors between pure white and pure black. This one is maybe kind of the more of like brighter option, so let's add another one in between. I think that should be enough, but maybe we are not going to use it even in the project. We don't know that, but when you're starting to create your colors, you should always add as many as you really want. It's much easier to just create more colors and maybe not work with all of them than create few colors and then midway through the project you realize that you need other colors and you add them and then it doesn't match with others. So maybe this is solid representation to create some grayscale for the project and to create the primary. Now how we are going to add them into our local styles, it's really simple. Just we are going to click on this rectangle and we are seeing this fill section right here, and there is styles and variables button. We can click on it, and now we are having custom libraries, etc. We can see all of our libraries, but what we can do is tap on new style or variable and, for example, name it primary. Description doesn't really need description, and create style. So when we click on canvas, for example, we are now seeing our color style primary. So when we add our rectangle, for example, and click on the rectangle, we can choose now from our library any other color that we created. So how I'm going to now create, for example, is this going to be, let's call it primary dark 1. and primary dark 2. And I'm going to do the same thing with this one. For example, let's call it primary light 1 and primary light, light 2. Okay, so we are having our primary dark 1, 2 and light 1, 2. Now what we can do is maybe add our pure black or dark, but let's call it black, just 0. Okay, and let's call this one white. So now we have just two basic colors and primary. It's just black, white and primary, and we need the shades between those colors in between. So now how we can maybe create these shades, it's really up to you. For example, what we can do is maybe just create it as a gray 1, gray 2, for example, and name it exactly as that until this color. And let's call this last one gray 8. Okay, now when we click on our canvas or anything, literally we can see our styles or libraries around here. So we can see we have our primary colors and our shades that we are going to use throughout the interface. Now what we can do is remove these rectangles or just maybe place them right here. It doesn't really matter because we have our style on the right. The next thing what we need to do is create our text styles. So how we are going to create our text styles and what those text styles really are. For example, in this case, we need some headings, we need some body type of text, we need our button text, we need our description text, maybe some subheadings, for example, in this case right here, or maybe some small descriptions or really small text like this one right here. So we need some variations, for example, and what I would suggest is maybe creating like 2, 3, 4 titles or big headings to use in the text styles, maybe some body, captions, sub captions or something like that, or subheadings. Now let's just start with it and hopefully you will understand it more. So how we are going to do that? For example, let's type this one, type text. Okay, and let's zoom it. In our case, what we need is maybe some font that we are going to use, the weight that that text really has, the size of the text, height or the line height of the text, letter spacing. We are not going to focus too much on that side. Paragraph spacing, even not so much on that. Auto width, auto height, fixed size, doesn't really matter when we are creating our design systems. And with alignments and maybe the way that it aligns the middle, top, on right, and maybe some other settings to make it underline or strike through or bullet point. In this course, we are going to focus just on basics, okay? So let's start with creating our big titles. Our first title is going to be maybe the biggest one. So let's create the size of maybe 34 and the line height it's suggesting to be 41, but let's just stick with 40. Why? Because some of the time we need our interface to be precisely aligned. Maybe it's not going to be all of the time because we are designing for the mobile, but if you also saw my course on the web design, we know the 4-point rule or 4-point grid rule. To use it through the interface, now it's not going to be applicable in this case, but if we can try to implement it into our design, it's going to be much better. So what does that mean? It means that our text size, it's not really important to be divided by 4. The line height is something that's important. For example, if we are having our rectangle, and let's set it maybe the size to the 40 by 40, okay? And when we are trying to align with the text, you see how it aligns with the top and the bottom, even though the text is not aligning with the top of this rectangle in this case, or maybe on the bottom with P or Y. But when we try to align it as a whole, you can see they're aligned. Why? Because the height of this text is 40 because of the line height, and we have our rectangle that's also 40. So throughout the interface, we are going to maybe align the elements in between. So we need to make sure that everything is properly aligned. So line height is most important stuff, not so much with the font size. So let's continue. So after we choose our font, for example, it's going to be Inter in this case. There are so many fonts, but while choosing your font, it's really not just needs to be simple without any crazy stuff going around. For example, this one, like, it doesn't really look good, or it's not going to work with our interface. But whatever text you like the most, you can choose it. There are differences between sans serif and sans serif fonts, so we don't need these crazy type of fonts, okay? So we'll just stick with simple stuff. It's going to be Inter, and the weight of this can be maybe let's say bold, for example. We can change it always with our colors. For example, if we need to change it, let's just click on the edit style, go to this one and change it however we like. So it's going to be pretty much the same with the text. So if we don't like this style, we can just always change it later. Let's duplicate this one and maybe create something else, maybe something a little bit smaller, for example 28 font, and let's stick with the size of 38, for example, and let's call it semi-bold. Let's duplicate it and make it even more smaller. For example, 22, for example, can work with a height of 28. Also semi-bold. Let's duplicate it one more time. Maybe create something like 20 with 24 height. Let's duplicate this text right here and maybe try to see, maybe the medium will work much better with 17 and maybe 20 height. Okay. Now maybe we can even focus on our body text, or maybe kind of subheading type of text. So maybe let's stick with 16 and 20 with the medium. Okay. And now let's try to create something like 14 and maybe with a line height of 16 with a regular. So maybe that can be our body text as well. Now let's create something else as well. Let's say we need a 12 with a 14. Okay, regular. And we would probably need something really small, but don't go too small. For example, 11 with 12 line height. Light is okay, but it's just too small to be the light, because when you zoom out, you really need your text to be visible for every single user. So let's just stick with this kind of weight for the font. Okay. So now what we are going to do is pretty much similar stuff to our colors that we previously worked. So how we are going to do that? For example, let's name this one a heading 1. How we can do that is just name it H1. Name this one to H2. This one can be H3. Let's call this one H4. Now we are seeing that we are going to medium section, so let's call it subheading, for example. This one is 16, for example, let's call it subheading 2. This one is 14 by 16 and with a regular, so let's call it just a normal body text that is going to be used mostly throughout the whole interface. It's going to be most commonly used when we are designing. Let's call this one, it's a 12, so let's call it maybe captions. And this smallest one, we can call it maybe footnote, for example. Okay, so now we are having our text styles and we are having our color styles that we are going to use throughout the whole interface. You are now noticing that this text is really small, but that's the way that we are going to work around, and we are going to use our standard sizes for the mobile. I will show you that in the next episode when we start working on our wireframes.